Don't touch the glass unless you can afford to replace the car behind it. The words sliced through the ballroom so sharply that even the jazz pianist near the marble staircase missed a note. A few guests laughed into their champagne flutes. Others turned just in time to see Naomi Carter freeze beside the towering display of Ferraris beneath the crystal lights of the Langford Grand Hotel in Manhattan. Her silver serving tray trembled slightly in her hands, not enough to spill the champagne, but enough for people to notice. Graham Whitmore noticed most of all. The luxury dealer stood near the center of the showroom floor in a navy tuxedo that probably cost more than Naomi made in 3 months. One polished hand rested casually against the roof of a midnight black Ferrari, while the other adjusted the diamond cufflink glinting beneath the chandeliers. "Relax," he added with a smirk, loud enough for nearby investors to hear. "I'm sure the hotel has insurance for accidents." Another ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Naomi lowered her eyes for half a second, then straightened her shoulders. "Yes, sir," she said softly. That was all. No anger. No embarrassment spilling out. Just 2 controlled words wrapped in dignity. The restraint somehow made the moment worse. Across the room, Victor Hale looked up from his whiskey glass. He had spent most of the evening avoiding conversations about acquisitions, taxes, and stock mergers, but the sound of public humiliation always carried differently, especially when the target refused to fight back. Victor watched Naomi move carefully across the illuminated glass floor suspended above 6 custom supercars displayed beneath the transparent panels. The reflections from the vehicles shimmered against the ceiling like liquid color. Red, silver, pearl white. Millions of dollars sitting beneath people who applauded cruelty as casually as jazz music. Naomi walked through them like she didn't belong there, and yet somehow carried more grace than anyone in the room. Her black uniform was simple, perfectly pressed despite the rain outside. A small silver horse keychain hung from the side of her apron pocket, tapping lightly against her leg every time she moved. Victor noticed that too. Near the entrance, thunder rolled softly beyond the giant windows overlooking Park Avenue. Rain streaked down the glass in silver lines. Valets rushed through the storm carrying umbrellas for wealthy guests arriving late to the gala. One of them approached Graham nervously. "Sir," the valet whispered, "there's an older car parked beside the VIP lane outside. We weren't sure if it belonged to one of the collectors." Graham frowned instantly. "What kind of car?" "Couldn't tell. It's covered." "Then tow it," Graham snapped. "This is a luxury event, not a junkyard." Naomi's fingers tightened around the tray. It was subtle, barely visible, but Victor saw it happen. For the first time all night, emotion cracked through her calm expression. Her eyes flicked toward the rain outside, toward the entrance, toward whatever sat hidden beneath that soaked gray cover. Graham noticed her reaction and laughed quietly. "Unless," he said mockingly, "the mystery scrap metal belongs to our waitress." More laughter followed. Naomi swallowed once. "Please," she said carefully, almost too quietly to hear. "Just don't move it yet." The room stilled for a strange second after she spoke. Not because of what she said, but because of how much fear lived beneath her composure. Victor slowly lowered his drink. Outside, lightning flashed across Manhattan, illuminating the rain-soaked shape beneath the tarp waiting silently at the curb. The rain intensified outside the hotel windows, turning Park Avenue into a river of blurred headlights and silver reflections. Inside the ballroom, the orchestra resumed playing, but the energy had shifted. Conversations no longer flowed naturally. Too many people kept glancing toward the entrance where the covered vehicle sat alone beneath the storm. Naomi continued serving champagne with careful movements, though Victor Hale noticed she had not looked away from the front doors for more than a few seconds at a time. Every distant rumble of thunder seemed to tighten something inside her. Graham Whitmore, meanwhile, appeared amused by the tension he had created. He strolled through the showroom floor, greeting investors and collectors as though the evening existed solely for his entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced suddenly, raising his glass near the center display, "next month Whitmore Luxury Motors will unveil the rarest private collection in Manhattan." Applause echoed politely around the room. Camera flashes sparked near the marble staircase. Graham smiled wider, feeding on the attention. "Some cars belong in museums," he continued. "Others belong forgotten under tarps in parking lots. Several guests laughed again, though less confidently this time. Victor did not. He watched Naomi lower her eyes and steady a tray that had begun trembling in her hands. A younger waiter beside her whispered softly, "You okay?" Naomi nodded immediately. "I am fine." But her voice sounded distant, distracted by whatever sat outside beneath the rain. Near the entrance, two valets approached the covered vehicle carrying tow equipment. Naomi saw them first. Her breath caught sharply. Before she could stop herself, she hurried across the glass floor, weaving carefully between guests in evening gowns and tailored suits. "Please wait," she called out. The nearest valet paused awkwardly. "Miss, we were told to move the car. Just give me a minute." Her voice remained polite, but urgency trembled underneath it. Graham turned slowly from across the ballroom, clearly entertained. "You really do know the owner," he said loudly. "That is incredible." A woman near him chuckled into her wineglass. Maybe Cinderella drove here after all. Naomi ignored them. She reached into her apron pocket and wrapped her fingers around the silver horse keychain Victor had noticed earlier. Rainwater dripped from the revolving hotel doors as cold air swept into the warm ballroom. The sound of traffic outside blended with the orchestra until everything felt strangely unreal. Victor set his whiskey down and followed several steps behind her. Something about Naomi's fear no longer matched embarrassment. It felt personal, protective, like someone trying desperately to guard the last remaining piece of a memory. One of the valets frowned at the tarp-covered shape. "Honestly," he muttered, "it looks old enough to belong in a scrapyard." Naomi flinched at the comment. Victor caught it immediately. Not anger. Pain. Graham walked toward the entrance with slow, confident steps, adjusting his cufflinks again as guests eagerly drifted after him. Wealthy people loved public humiliation as long as it happened to someone else. "Well," Graham announced, "since everyone is suddenly fascinated by the mystery vehicle, perhaps we should see what our waitress has been hiding." Naomi stepped in front of the car instinctively. Rain blew across her uniform, darkening the sleeves. "Please do not touch it," she said quietly. Graham stopped only a few feet away. "Why?" he asked with a smirk. "Afraid we will discover you drove your grandfather's tractor into my gala?" A few nervous laughs escaped the crowd, but Victor noticed something else now. Naomi was no longer embarrassed. She was scared. Truly scared. Her fingers tightened around the keychain until her knuckles turned pale beneath the rain. Victor looked past her toward the long shape beneath the gray tarp. Even covered, the outline felt wrong for an ordinary car. Lower. Wider. Familiar somehow. Then lightning flashed across the street again, and for half a second, Victor saw the unmistakable curve beneath the soaked fabric. His expression changed instantly. Victor Hale stepped closer to the rain-soaked curb, his polished shoes splashing lightly against the pavement outside the Langford Grand Hotel. Behind him, the crowd pressed near the entrance beneath the gold lights of the revolving doors, curiosity spreading through the gala faster than the storm itself. Naomi stood frozen beside the covered vehicle, one hand gripping the silver horse keychain so tightly it dug into her palm. Graham Whitmore smiled as if the entire moment had become a private performance arranged for his amusement. "Well," Graham said casually to the valets, "take it off." Naomi inhaled sharply. "Please," she whispered again, but her voice disappeared beneath another crack of thunder rolling over Manhattan. One of the valets hesitated before grabbing the edge of the tarp. Rainwater poured down the fabric in silver streams. Victor's eyes narrowed. He already knew that shape. Or at least he thought he did. The proportions were impossible to mistake if you loved cars enough. Long hood. Low stance. Wide rear frame. His heartbeat slowed strangely. Graham folded his arms with smug confidence. "Let us see what our mystery waitress drives." The valet yanked the tarp backward. Gasps rippled through the crowd instantly. Even the orchestra inside seemed to stop playing at the exact same moment. Beneath the rain stood a deep midnight blue 1965 Shelby Cobra Roadster, its polished curves gleaming beneath the hotel lights like liquid steel. Water rolled slowly across the bodywork. The chrome side pipes reflected flashes of lightning from the avenue. The white racing stripes down the center were worn slightly with age, but unmistakably authentic. Nobody spoke for nearly 3 seconds. Then the whispers began. "No way. That cannot be real." Is that an original CSX? Graham's smirk vanished first. Victor stepped forward without realizing he had moved. His eyes locked onto the car, as though the rest of Manhattan had disappeared around it. He had spent nearly 15 years searching private collections, auctions, and hidden estates for one exactly like this. Most experts believed the remaining original Cobras had already been accounted for decades ago. Yet here one stood in the rain beside a frightened waitress wearing a hotel apron. Victor slowly circled the vehicle, barely hearing the voices around him anymore. The paint, the vents, the handcrafted aluminum body lines. Every detail looked painfully authentic. Graham forced out an uneasy laugh. It is probably a replica, he said quickly. People build copies all the time. But his voice lacked conviction now. Victor crouched slightly beside the front wheel. His fingers hovered inches above the body without touching it. Then he saw it. Etched subtly near the lower panel was a faded insignia almost nobody alive still recognized. A small silver horse beside the initials DC. Victor's breath caught. Naomi noticed immediately. Her expression shifted from fear to something more vulnerable. Recognition. Where did you get this car? Victor asked quietly. The crowd fell silent. Again. Naomi looked at the Shelby before answering. Rain dripped from loose strands of dark hair against her cheeks. It belonged to my father. Graham scoffed instantly. Your father owned a multi-million-dollar Cobra? Naomi met his eyes for the first time that night. My father built engines, she said softly. He worked on this one before I was born. Victor stood slowly now, staring at the insignia again. DC Daniel Carter. The name surfaced through memories buried nearly 20 years deep. Stories whispered through elite racing circles about a brilliant black mechanic from Detroit whose engineering work had quietly improved performance cars, owned by wealthy collectors who never publicly acknowledged him. Victor remembered hearing older racers say Daniel Carter could make an engine sing like music. He also remembered hearing that Daniel disappeared after a workshop fire shut down his garage decades earlier. Nobody had mentioned him since. Graham looked between Naomi and the car with growing discomfort. The laughter from earlier had vanished completely. Wealthy guests who had mocked Naomi less than 10 minutes ago now stared at her with open disbelief. Naomi rested one trembling hand gently against the Shelby's rain-covered hood. He told me never to sell it, she said quietly. Even when things got hard. Victor looked at her differently now. Not as a waitress standing beside an expensive car, but as someone carrying the last surviving piece of a forgotten legacy. Rain hammered against the streets of Manhattan while the crowd stood gathered beneath the glowing hotel entrance, staring at the Shelby Cobra as though it had materialized from another lifetime. Nobody laughed anymore. The same guests who had mocked Naomi minutes earlier now whispered behind raised glasses and designer coats, their voices filled with disbelief instead of amusement. Victor Hale remained beside the car, eyes fixed on the faded silver horse insignia near the lower panel. The memory would not leave him now. Detroit. 23 years earlier. A private racing event outside Chicago. An older collector leaning over an engine bay and muttering, "If Daniel Carter touched the motor, you do not change a thing." Victor had been young then, obsessed with speed, wealth, and reputation. He remembered hearing that name spoken with respect by men who respected almost nobody. Daniel Carter. A mechanic who never became famous because the industry preferred his work more than his presence. Victor slowly looked up at Naomi. Rainwater shimmered across the hood between them. Your father was Daniel Carter? Naomi nodded once. Most people forgot him. Her voice carried no bitterness. Somehow that made the sadness heavier. Graham Whitmore shoved his hands into his pockets and forced another uneasy smile. Even if the story is true, the car still needs authentication. Nobody answered him. Not immediately. A gray-haired collector near the entrance stepped closer, staring openly now. That chassis line, he whispered. Dear God. Another man adjusted his glasses. I saw one like this at Barrett-Jackson 15 years ago. It sold for nearly $8 million. Graham's jaw tightened visibly. Naomi lowered her eyes again as though the numbers embarrassed her. Victor noticed that too. Most people would have chased attention in this moment. Naomi seemed uncomfortable standing inside it. Why are you working here? Victor asked quietly. The question lingered beneath the storm. Naomi brushed rainwater from her sleeve before answering. My mother is sick. The simplicity of the answer silenced everyone again. Hospital bills? Victor asked. She nodded. And the house taxes? The garage too. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the Shelby. My father left us the car and the shop, but memories do not pay electric bills. Graham finally laughed again, though it sounded thinner now. Well, there it is. She kept the car hidden because she wants leverage. Naomi looked at him calmly. No, sir. Then why bring it here? Graham challenged. Because the transmission slips when it rains, she replied softly. And tonight was the only place in Manhattan with security cameras strong enough that I thought nobody would try stealing it. The honesty of the answer landed harder than any argument could have. Several people looked away uncomfortably. Victor watched Naomi differently now. She was standing in cold rain wearing a hotel waitress uniform beside a car worth more than most penthouses in the city. Yet the only thing she seemed worried about was protecting what remained of her father's legacy. A valet approached nervously. Miss Carter, he said carefully, the rear tire is losing air. Naomi's face changed instantly. Panic flickered beneath her composure for the first time all evening. She hurried toward the back wheel and crouched beside it, rain soaking through her sleeves. No, 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 she whispered under her breath. Victor stepped beside her immediately. The tire had indeed begun sagging slowly against the pavement. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. The seal has been weak for months, she admitted quietly. I was saving money to repair it. Graham folded his arms. A priceless car sitting on damaged tires. Brilliant. Victor turned toward him sharply then, his expression colder than before. Enough. The single word cut through the rain harder than thunder. Graham blinked, surprised. Victor rarely raised his voice in public. Victor looked back down at Naomi kneeling beside the Shelby with one hand resting gently against the wet chrome wheel. Her movements were careful, almost protective, like someone comforting a living thing. Then Victor noticed something else through the open driver's side window. Resting on the passenger seat was an old leather jacket folded neatly beside a faded photograph. Naomi saw him looking and quickly reached inside the car to shield the picture from the rain. But not before Victor caught a glimpse of the image. A younger Daniel Carter standing beside the same Shelby Cobra. And next to him was a teenage Victor Hale. The photograph remained half hidden beneath Naomi's hand, but Victor Hale had already seen enough to feel the air leave his lungs. Rain drummed softly against the Shelby, while the glowing lights of the Langford Grand Hotel reflected across the soaked pavement like fractured gold. For a moment, the noise of Manhattan seemed impossibly far away. Victor stared at the faded image inside the car window. A younger Daniel Carter stood beside the Shelby with grease on his hands and a proud smile across his face. Beside him stood a thin 17-year-old boy wearing a racing jacket 2 sizes too large and grinning like he had just discovered heaven. Victor recognized himself instantly. Naomi noticed the change in his face. You knew him, she said quietly. It was not really a question. Victor swallowed slowly. A long time ago. Graham Whitmore stepped closer again, clearly irritated by losing control of the evening. Victor, he said with forced laughter, surely you are not getting sentimental over an old photograph. Victor ignored him completely. His eyes never left the picture. Memories flooded back now with painful clarity. Detroit summers. The smell of gasoline and hot metal. A tiny garage near 8 Mile Road where Daniel Carter rebuilt engines by hand, while an awkward rich teenager watched in fascination. Victor's father had invested in racing companies back then, but he had barely noticed his own son. Daniel had. Daniel had spoken to him like he mattered. Taught him how to listen to engines instead of simply buying them. He used to let me hand him tools, Victor said softly, almost to himself. Naomi blinked. You are Victor Hale. Back then I was just a kid trying not to strip bolts. The corner of Naomi's mouth almost lifted for the first time that night. Around them, wealthy guests stood listening in complete silence now. The power in the room had shifted so gradually that nobody noticed exactly when it happened. Graham certainly noticed it now. This is ridiculous, he muttered. One old mechanic and a rusty nostalgia story do not suddenly turn a waitress into royalty. Naomi's expression hardened slightly, though her voice remained calm. My father never wanted royalty. Graham folded his arms. Then what did he want? Naomi looked down at the Shelby. Rain slid across the hood beneath the city lights. Respect. The single word landed heavier than anyone expected. Victor closed his eyes briefly. Daniel Carter had deserved that respect. Instead, wealthy collectors had quietly used his genius while keeping him invisible. Victor remembered it clearly now. Daniel would arrive at tracks through side entrances while rich owners accepted trophies beside. Engines Daniel rebuilt with his own hands. What happened to him? Victor asked carefully. Naomi hesitated before answering. The garage closed after a fire when I was 9. Her fingers brushed the leather jacket inside the car. After that, he worked wherever people would hire him. Small repair shops mostly. And the car? He kept it hidden. She looked toward the skyline beyond the rain. He said some people only value things after they disappear. Graham shook his head impatiently. Wonderful speech. Are we done now? Victor turned slowly toward him, and for the first time all evening Graham seemed genuinely uncomfortable beneath another man's gaze. You humiliated her before learning who she was, Victor said evenly. Graham forced a scoff. She is still a waitress. And you are still a man who could not recognize value standing directly in front of him. The silence after that felt enormous. Several guests lowered their eyes. One investor quietly stepped away from Graham altogether. Naomi looked stunned by the defense. Victor rarely embarrassed people publicly. Everyone in Manhattan knew that, which made this moment far more humiliating than shouting ever could have been. Then another hiss escaped from the Shelby's rear tire. Naomi immediately crouched beside it again, concern overtaking everything else. Victor looked at the sagging rubber, then toward the glowing garage entrance beneath the hotel. Bring the car inside, he ordered the valets. Graham frowned instantly. Victor, that vehicle is not part of the exhibition. Victor's voice remained calm. Tonight it is. The valets moved without hesitation. And for the first time since arriving at the gala, Naomi Carter looked at Victor Hale not as a billionaire, but as someone her father might once have trusted. The Shelby rolled slowly through the illuminated service entrance beneath the Langford Grand Hotel, while rainwater streamed from its polished body onto the marble floor below. Every employee near the garage stopped working to stare. Mechanics, valets, even kitchen staff drifted closer as whispers spread through the lower level of the building. Nobody could believe the same waitress who had spent the evening carrying champagne trays owned a car collectors would spend decades searching for. Naomi walked beside the vehicle in silence, one hand resting lightly against the wet fender as if reassuring it through the movement. Victor Hale followed only a few steps behind. Graham Whitmore remained farther back near the entrance, visibly irritated that the attention had shifted completely away from him and onto a woman he had mocked less than an hour earlier. Inside the garage, bright fluorescent lights reflected sharply across the Shelby's midnight blue paint. The car looked almost unreal now that the rain had been washed away. Every curve gleamed beneath the white ceiling lights like sculpture instead of machinery. Victor circled the vehicle slowly, studying details he had not noticed outside in the storm. The leather seats had aged beautifully. The steering wheel showed faint wear from years of careful hands. Even the dashboard carried tiny imperfections that proved authenticity better than any certificate ever could. It is really his work, Victor murmured softly. Naomi nodded. My father rebuilt the engine twice. She opened the driver's side door carefully, almost reverently. The rich scent of old leather and machine oil drifted into the garage air. Several mechanics nearby exchanged stunned looks immediately. One older mechanic stepped closer before stopping himself. That smell, he whispered. Real vintage fuel tuning. Naomi reached beneath the seat and removed a worn notebook wrapped carefully in cloth. She hesitated for half a second before offering it to Victor. He kept records of every modification. Victor accepted it gently. The notebook looked ordinary at first glance. Faded black cover. Bent corners. Oil stains darkened the edges. But when Victor opened the first page, his expression shifted completely. Detailed handwritten engine diagrams filled the paper in precise blue ink. Timing ratios. Carburetor adjustments. Hand-drawn airflow calculations. Daniel Carter's signature appeared at the bottom of nearly every page. Victor turned another page more quickly now, Then another. The garage faded around him. He was 17 again, standing inside that tiny Detroit workshop while Daniel explained horsepower like music theory. Nobody writes engineering notes like this anymore, Victor said quietly. Naomi lowered her eyes. He used to say engines have personalities. One of the mechanics laughed softly in disbelief. That is not a mechanic's notebook, he muttered. That is artwork. Graham finally stepped forward again, trying to regain authority. Very impressive, he admitted stiffly. But sentiment does not change market value. Victor looked up sharply. You still think this is about market value? Graham spread his hands defensively. Everything has a price. Naomi answered before Victor could. Not everything. The simplicity of her voice silenced him again. Victor noticed the exhaustion behind her calm now. Tiny shadows beneath her eyes. Fingers roughened from work. The strain of someone carrying responsibilities too heavy for one person alone. Yet she still protected the car before protecting herself. How long have you been working double shifts? Victor asked quietly. Naomi looked surprised by the question. Since February. And your mother? Naomi hesitated. Stage 3 kidney disease. Several people nearby lowered their eyes immediately. Victor glanced back toward the Shelby. Suddenly the car felt heavier somehow. Not because of money, because of sacrifice. Naomi had likely spent months choosing hospital bills over repairs, while preserving the only surviving piece of her father's life. Victor looked back down at the notebook. Tucked inside one of the pages sat another photograph he had not noticed before. He carefully pulled it free. This one showed Daniel Carter standing beside a much younger Naomi in front of the garage. She could not have been older than 8. Daniel crouched beside her with grease on both hands while she held a wrench almost too large for her small arms. On the back of the photograph, faded handwriting curved across the paper in blue ink. For Naomi. Never let rich men decide your worth. Victor stared at the sentence for a long moment. Then he slowly looked toward Graham Whitmore standing under the fluorescent lights with his expensive watch and uncomfortable silence. And for the first time all evening, Graham looked like the poorest man in the room. The garage had grown strangely quiet by midnight. Most of the gala guests had returned upstairs, but a small group still lingered near the Shelby Cobra beneath the fluorescent lights, unable to pull themselves away from the story unfolding around it. Mechanics whispered softly among themselves while valets pretended to organize equipment just to remain close enough to listen. Outside, the storm over Manhattan had finally begun to weaken, though rain still tapped gently against the loading dock doors like distant applause. Naomi stood beside the Shelby with Daniel Carter's notebook pressed carefully against her chest. Victor Hale remained near the front bumper, studying the engine bay that had just been opened beneath the bright garage lights. Every polished component looked handcrafted with impossible precision. One mechanic shook his head slowly in disbelief. This motor should not even exist in this condition. Victor barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on the tiny details Daniel Carter used to obsess over. The airflow routing, the fuel balance, the hand-cut modifications modern engineers would never have thought to attempt. It was genius hidden inside steel. Graham Whitmore checked his watch impatiently before speaking again. Victor, enough nostalgia. If the car is authentic, then let us speak realistically. Naomi's shoulders stiffened slightly. Victor closed the hood slowly and looked toward him. Graham stepped forward with the confidence of a man used to winning negotiations. I will offer $2 million tonight. Several mechanics nearly choked at the number. Naomi did not react. Graham continued smoothly. Cash transfer by morning. No auctions. No publicity headaches. Your mother gets treatment. You walk away comfortable. Naomi lowered her eyes to the concrete floor. For a second, Victor thought he saw temptation flicker across her face. Not greed. Exhaustion. The kind carried by people who spend too long surviving. Graham noticed it too and smiled slightly. That is more money than most people see in 3 lifetimes. Naomi's fingers brushed the leather. Jacket still folded inside the Shelby. My father used to say rich people always think the first number is the hardest to refuse. Graham laughed softly. And was he wrong? Naomi looked up slowly now. Calm. Steady. Yes. The answer landed like a door closing. Graham's smile faded. 3 million, he said immediately. Tonight. Victor watched Naomi carefully. She was trembling slightly now, but not from fear. Emotion. Pressure. The weight of hospital bills and overdue taxes colliding against memory and loyalty. Rainwater still clung to loose curls around her face beneath the harsh garage lights. She looked exhausted enough to collapse, and yet somehow stronger than anyone else standing there. Graham spread his hands. You are working double shifts carrying trays while sitting beside an $8 million car. That is not loyalty. That is foolishness. Naomi walked slowly toward the Shelby and rested one hand against the hood. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the midnight blue paint. Do you know what my father did the last week before he died? She asked quietly. Nobody answered. He could barely stand long enough to finish rebuilding the carburetor. Her voice shook once before steadying again. And still every morning he walked into that garage and wiped fingerprints off this car before touching anything else. Victor lowered his eyes. Naomi swallowed carefully. Not because it was expensive. She looked toward the silver horse insignia near the front panel. Because it was the only thing the world could not take credit for. Silence filled the garage completely. Even Graham said nothing for several seconds. Then he exhaled sharply. 5 million. Several people stared at him in shock now. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Victor saw the pain in her face then. The hospital bills. Her mother struggling to breathe. The temptation to finally rest. Graham stepped closer, sensing weakness. You can buy your mother the best care in New York. You can leave waitress jobs behind forever. Naomi opened her eyes again slowly. There were tears there now, but her voice remained calm. And what happens when the money is gone? Graham frowned impatiently. You move on. Naomi shook her head gently. This car is the last proof my father mattered. The fluorescent lights reflected across the Shelby while nobody spoke. Victor looked at Naomi then with something deeper than admiration. Respect. Because in a city where nearly everything could be bought, this exhausted young woman carrying overdue hospital bills had just refused $5 million to protect her father's name. The garage remained silent long after Naomi refused the $5 million. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead while rainwater dripped from the undercarriage of the Shelby onto the concrete floor in slow, steady taps. Nobody moved. Nobody laughed anymore. The same wealthy guests who had once treated Naomi like invisible hotel staff now stood staring at her with expressions somewhere between confusion and shame. Graham Whitmore adjusted the sleeve of his tuxedo sharply, clearly struggling to understand what had just happened. Men in his world measured value through numbers, contracts, ownership, status. But Naomi Carter had just turned down enough money to erase every problem in her life without hesitation. Graham glanced around the garage and realized something deeply uncomfortable. The room respected her now. Not him. Victor Hale slowly closed Daniel Carter's notebook and handed it back to Naomi carefully, almost ceremonially. Your father was right, he said quietly. Naomi frowned slightly. About what? Victor looked toward Graham for half a second before answering. About rich men. Several mechanics nearby lowered their heads to hide faint smiles. Graham noticed. Color rose into his face. This is becoming absurd, he snapped. Everyone here is acting like she cured cancer because she refused an offer. Naomi said nothing. She simply folded the notebook against her chest and looked toward the Shelby again. Victor studied Graham calmly. Do you know what the difference is between wealth and legacy? Graham scoffed. Please enlighten me. Victor gestured toward the car. Wealth impresses people for a moment. Then he looked at Naomi. Legacy changes what survives after you are gone. The words settled heavily across the garage. Graham forced a thin laugh. Very poetic. But eventually sentiment loses to reality. No, Victor replied evenly. Sometimes reality is exactly what exposes sentimentless people. Graham's jaw tightened. He glanced around the garage again, expecting support from the crowd that had followed him all evening. Instead he found silence. Investors who once laughed at his jokes now avoided eye contact altogether. One collector quietly stepped toward Naomi instead and asked softly, Would your father ever allow anyone else to work on the engine? Naomi blinked, surprised by the respect in his tone. Only people who listened before touching anything. The older collector nodded slowly. Then he was smarter than most of us. Graham exhaled sharply through his nose. This is unbelievable. Victor stepped closer now, his voice remaining calm enough to cut deeper than shouting ever could. You humiliated a woman carrying more dignity in one soaked waitress uniform than most people in this city carry in custom suits. Graham stared at him speechless. Victor rarely spoke publicly with emotion. That made every word impossible to ignore. Naomi looked stunned herself. She was not used to being defended by powerful people. Certainly not like this. Graham straightened his posture again, trying desperately to reclaim control. Fine, he said coldly. Keep the car. Keep the story. But eventually reality catches everyone. Naomi finally looked directly at him. Her voice stayed soft. Reality already did. The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Several mechanics exchanged glances immediately. Graham opened his mouth then stopped, because for the first time all night, he understood something humiliating. The room no longer admired him. They pitied him. Victor turned toward the Shelby and ran one hand lightly along the polished hood without touching the paint. Do you know why your father mattered so much to people who truly understood cars? He asked Naomi quietly. She shook her head once. Victor smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind it. Because Daniel Carter made machines feel human. Naomi's eyes glistened beneath the fluorescent lights. Victor looked around the garage, slowly before continuing. And tonight his daughter reminded a room full of wealthy strangers what humanity actually looks like. Nobody spoke after that. The silence itself became the verdict. Graham Whitmore stood alone near the garage entrance beneath the harsh white lights while Naomi remained beside the Shelby surrounded not by money, but by something far rarer. Respect. By 2:30 in the morning, most of the gala lights inside the Langford Grand Hotel had dimmed. The orchestra was gone. Champagne glasses sat abandoned on marble tables upstairs while Manhattan settled into the cold silver quiet that only arrived after midnight storms. Down in the garage, however, the Shelby Cobra still gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights like a memory refusing to fade. Naomi stood beside the driver's side door fastening the old leather jacket around her shoulders. The sleeves were slightly too large, but she wore it carefully, as though wrapping herself inside a piece of her father's presence. Nearby, mechanics continued walking slow circles around the car, unable to stop admiring it. But now they kept respectful distance. Nobody treated it like property anymore. Felt closer to history. Victor Hale leaned quietly against a concrete pillar watching Naomi check the repaired rear tire one final time. He had already paid for the replacement seal without mentioning it. She noticed anyway. You did not have to do that, she said softly. Victor slipped his hands into his coat pockets. Your father once spent 3 hours helping me rebuild a transmission after I destroyed it trying to impress people. Naomi smiled faintly. That sounds like him. Victor looked toward the Shelby with distant eyes. He never made me feel stupid for not knowing something. Naomi closed the trunk gently. He used to say pride is loud when talent is missing. Victor laughed quietly under his breath. The sound echoed softly through the garage. For the first time all evening, the tension between them felt gone. Just two people standing beside the last surviving proof of someone they both respected. Near the elevator entrance, Graham Whitmore finally emerged again, though the confidence from earlier had disappeared completely. His tuxedo jacket hung open now, his expression tired beneath the fluorescent lights. He stopped several feet away from Naomi. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Graham cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Carter. Naomi turned slowly. Graham glanced toward the Shelby before lowering his eyes. I misjudged you tonight. The apology sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, like a language he rarely spoke. Naomi studied him calmly. You misjudged my father first. Graham swallowed once. Victor remained silent, letting the moment belong entirely to her. Graham nodded stiffly. Perhaps I did. Naomi did not humiliate him in return. She did not lecture him or demand anything. She simply opened the driver's side door and rested one hand on the roof of the Shelby. My father always said people reveal themselves when they think someone has nothing. Graham lowered his gaze completely after that. It was the closest thing to defeat Victor had ever seen from him. Naomi slid into the driver's seat carefully. The old engine roared to life a second later, low and powerful, vibrating through the concrete garage like distant thunder. Every mechanic nearby instinctively smiled. The sound was not just mechanical. It felt alive. Naomi adjusted her hands on the steering wheel, while the dashboard lights glowed softly against her face. Victor stepped closer to the open window. "Where will you go now?" Naomi looked toward the garage exit where the wet streets of Manhattan shimmered beneath streetlights in fading rain. "Home first," she answered quietly. "My mother likes hearing the engine when she cannot sleep." Victor nodded slowly. "Daniel would be proud of you." Naomi's eyes glistened for half a second before she looked away. "I hope so." The garage door rolled open with a metallic hum, revealing the sleeping city beyond. Rain had finally stopped. Steam drifted upward from the pavement while distant traffic lights reflected across the wet streets like ribbons of gold and red. Naomi eased the Shelby forward slowly. The silver horse insignia flashed beneath the garage lights one final time before the car moved into the night. Victor stood watching from the entrance, with his hands in his coat pockets as the sound of the engine echoed farther and farther down the avenue. Around him, million-dollar supercars sat silent beneath polished lights. But none of them carried what that old Shelby carried: memory, sacrifice, dignity, legacy. And as Naomi disappeared into the sleeping streets of Manhattan wearing her father's jacket and driving the machine the world once ignored, Victor Hale realized something that no amount of wealth had ever taught him before. Some people inherit money, others inherit meaning.